continuing with our scrimba course, and let's start.
Another color. Really, your imagination is the limit here. When you're ready, we will move on to part 2 of our original challenge.
Let's leave.
It's time for part 2 of this challenge. I want you to move our div here into a separate component called box. And then when you're mapping over our squares, you will render that box component. That box component should receive a prop called on, and it will be the value of this square.on. From our original boxes.js, each one of them has an on property, and that value is what you're going to pass to your new box component. Then inside of that box component, I want you to create a dynamic style like we did in the last screencast to determine the background color of the box. If the box is on, then you should set the background color to this hex value, and if it's off, you can just set it to the string none. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge.
Okay. And what do we have to do? Pass the box component a prop called on with the value of the same name from the box's object. So this is actually, I don't know.
And it is rendering. However, opponent key is going to be broken, and actually I'm going to pass this key into the box component. So let's go ahead and render our box component, which will be self-closing. This class name is already handled on the div that box is rendering. However, I will keep the key right here. The next part says to pass it a prop called on. So I'll say on equals, and then the value will be square.on. Again, each square here represents one of the objects in my array, and that has a property called on. Let's just make sure that everything is working so far. In my box component, I will console log props.on. And because I have 6 instances, I should get 6 values here. Oh, and of course, I did not import my box component, so I need to import box from box. Okay, let's try that again. Awesome. Okay, so I get my 6 values, true, false, true, true, false, false, and that's matching perfectly with what I see in my data here. Then the last part of this challenge is simply to make use of props.on to determine what the hex value or the background color should actually be. So using dynamic styles, I will create a variable called styles, and that's going to be an object where the background none is going to look at props.on, and if it's true, it will be this dark color, and if it's false, it will be none. Then I can simply add a style prop. Notice that my variable is called styles. You really can call this whatever you want. However, this attribute or this property needs to be style exactly that way. So I'll set that equal to the object that I created above. And I think I should see this one is dark. It was true, false, true, true, false, false. So this one should be dark, this one, and this one should be dark, and the rest should be clear. And that's exactly what we get. Next, we're approaching probably the most challenging part, and that is where clicking the box will actually flip the on value from true to false or false to true. I'll give you some hand holding in that challenge, but honestly, it's going to be a pretty fun one, so that's what we will work on in the next lesson. In the next 2 challenges, we are actually going to be starting to dip our toes into some intermediate React topics here. The concept of changing state is what we have been practicing this whole time. However, we're going to see 2 different ways that we could structure this project and talk about which one is going to be the better of the 2. I put together a little diagram to make this a little simpler to understand. Right now we have an app component, and this app component is keeping track of an array of data. We're then using that array to create box components for every item in that array. Track of an array of data. We're then using that array to create box components for every item in that array, and passing to those box components a prop called on, which will have the value either true or false. Currently, those box components are then taking this incoming prop and determining what the background color should be. However, at this point in time, they have no way to modify that incoming prop. Keep in mind that in reality, a component should never modify props. In other words, my box component should never say props.on equals something different. However, we do have some ways that we can still make changes to the background color of our box, and that's what we're going to be talking about. The first way we're going to see is to initialize new state in each one of these box components and set its initial value to the incoming props.on value. One benefit in doing it this way is the simplicity in allowing each box to then update its own state. Of course, by doing so, automatically every instance of our box component will also have the ability to update its own state. When I first started learning React, this was the most obvious way to allow each of these boxes the ability to flip its own value. And so that's what your challenge is this time. I want you to create some state inside of our box component. You'll determine its initial value based on the
Okay, I can do this. I think I can do this.
props.on value. You'll also create an event listener so that when the div of the box gets clicked, it can flip the value from true false or false to true. While you're at it, don't forget to update your styles here in this ternary. Currently, it's looking at props.on. You'll want to make sure that you're looking at the local state instead of the incoming value of props.on. And the last thing is a quick change I made. In the previous screencast, I had set this to none, but it turns out this should actually be transparent if I want this to empty out the color. So don't let that be confusing. Okay, this is your time. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge.
So what I have to do is basically create another state. So I can do that. What should I call it? BG color, BGC or PGC? This can be. And this will take props dot on, and we can change that type. And then we need to add an event listener. How do I add it? And this is going to change this type. Oh, we have to use maybe set PGC is equal to not of, basically this will take previous is equals to not of previous, and I think this should, come on, how did this just work? This is amazing. Feels great.
In truth, this is very similar to what we have already done so far. I'll initialize the initial value should be determined by looking at props.function, let's call it toggle. I can then set this up as a click event listener to run toggle. Should be able to clean this challenge up, hit refresh, and sure enough, I'm able to flip the value. Now, it's not readily apparent, but keep in mind that what we've done is we've given each one of these boxes its own value of state. So basically, we've given it the ability to control itself. We've given it the control over its on value. Now, I understand the boxes seems a little bit contrived. However, this same concept would apply to something like a to-do list, for example. Our app would be like the to-do list, and each of these boxes would be like a to-do item. The value of on might be replaced with a value called maybe completed as to whether or not that to-do item has been completed. Structuring it the way that we just did here, every item in our to-do list would be in charge of knowing if it by itself has already been completed or not. When I first started writing React, this seemed like the most obvious thing to do. However, I've since learned that there actually is a better way to structure our application so that state is only held in the app component in our example here. There certainly might be a situation that there actually is a better way to structure our application so that state is only held in the app component in our example here. There certainly might be situations where creating state in each one of the child components and initializing that state based on the incoming props might make sense. However, general consensus is that if you find yourself initializing state by using the incoming value of some prop, there's probably a better way to do this. And that's what we'll be diving into in the next lesson. Previously, what we did is we created new state inside each of our box components and initialized that state based on the incoming prop of on. And it turns out there's actually a name for when you create state that is initialized by incoming props, and it's called derived state. And I'm sorry to break this to you, but it turns out a name for when state inside each of our box components and initialize that state based on the incoming prop of on. And it turns out there's actually a name for when you create state that is initialized by incoming props, and it's called derived state. And I'm sorry to break this to you, but it turns out that you probably don't need derived state. This is an article that was written in 2018. You can click on the link. It's in the React documentation. It will probably get a little bit heavy if you're still a beginner in React, but it turns out that there can be some weirdness that happens if you pass a prop to a component and then just take that prop and set state based on that prop. If you React, but it turns out that there can be some weirdness that happens if you pass a prop to a component and then just take that prop and set state based on that prop. If you think about it, in app.js, we actually created some state in app.js to maintain all of the squares already. So when we set state in each one of our boxes, we had state both in the app and in every one of our boxes, which in the end means that there are two sources of truth. When the box had the ability to update its own state, it was not updating the state on the app component. It was only updating its local state that it had derived based on the incoming props. And because of that, there were multiple sources of truth. Now, certainly there are circumstances where derived state makes sense. This article does talk about some examples of that. However, it's far less common than I think most people end up using when they're writing React applications. And the whole reason I decided to talk about this in this course is to help you navigate a scenario that, at least for me, was really tricky when I was learning. So we're going to approach this in a different way. Instead of putting state and a setter inside of each one of our boxes, we're going to make use of the state that already exists in our app. And instead, we're going to create a function called toggle inside of our app component, and then pass that toggle function down to each one of our box instances. Anytime one of the box components gets clicked, it will run this toggle function and essentially tell the app component, hey, the state that you're maintaining needs to change. Then when that state changes, let's say this first object gets clicked and it changes from true to false, React will re-render the app component because its state has changed, and therefore will re-render the box components, but now with the first one having an on value of false. You certainly are going to notice that this way of doing things is more complex. However, in the end, it is a better practice than using derived state to manage our state. Because of the additional complexity, I'm going to give you a challenge that has you doing part of this, and then we're going to walk through completing it together. So let's go ahead and get started. The challenge is for you to create that toggle function that for now is just going to log clicked to the console. Then I want you to pass that function down to each of the box components and set it up so that when they get clicked, it simply runs the function, which means it will console log clicked. I've already removed the state from our box component down to each of the box components and set it.
Okay, so we can say that to okay, and pass that function down to each of the box components. Since this is a React component, we cannot say on click on this, so we will go here, set here to be on click is equals to what should we do here? And reflect. Amazing, it works. And I think I can change the color also. So let's change the color then. So I change it to how do I change it? Set square size. I don't know. How do I set it? So what exactly is square? Square is, let's see, what's a square? A square is this. Hmm. So it's an array of objects with an ID and a node. So I maybe can change ID. How do I change it? Dot 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 previous state. So this will be another function. And what this will do is this is an object, right? Comma and on will change to not of previous state dot on basically. Let's save this. And, okay. What if happened? If there is a non-property, there's a non-property, and this is. I don't know why it's not changing. But this won't work, right? Hmm. So actually, this should only happen to the box we clicked, right? So I'm changing it for everyone. So this should happen for anyone, but even though it's happening for everyone, this should not show an error. Why the fuck is it showing you the error? Okay, please don't show an error. Let me see the console. The ruler effort, the app component. An app consider adding an inner boundary to a tree to customize inner handling behavior. What does this mean? I think it's time to let's save another note. How do I save? How do I save? How do I save? I don't know. I can actually copy this to be honest. Huh. And then I can go.
Up so that when they get clicked, it simply runs the function, which means it will console log clicked. I've already. Okay, pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Simply enough, it's going to select the on handle click now, and we'll pass down the talking about handling an event. However, I also could just give it the name of the listener. I think more often I'll choose something like handle click that makes it very clear that I'm talking about handling an event. However, I also could just give it the name of the function. Really, we can do whatever we want here. Let's stick with toggle for now, and we'll pass down the toggle function. And now I'll hit save, and clicking it, awesome, run. And this is where it does need to be on click with a capital C. We'll use props.toggle. I'll hit save. and clicking it, awesome, runs the function that we defined. This is the point where some additional complexity needs to be added in order for this to work correctly. When each box was initializing its own state, it was really simple to know which box was flipping its value because, well, each box was maintaining its own state. However, now with our toggle function, the toggle function has no idea which box just ran its code. So in my app component, if I wanted to use set squares, because squares is an array, I need to figure out which of the items in the array triggered set squares so that I can update the correct one and leave all the other ones exactly how they were. And this is where we are essentially forced to do something a bit clever. And I figured at this point it'd be better for me to walk you through some examples of how we might solve this problem. Let me clean up our challenge. Our goal is to give the toggle function the ability to know which box was clicked so that we can correctly update the state array. One way we could do that is to make it so that the toggle function takes the ID of the box as a parameter. However, as it's currently set up, this is not going to work. And that's because in our onClick here, we really don't get to decide what parameter gets passed to our function. Every browser will pass an event handler function, the event itself. It's an event object, but we really don't get to decide what parameter gets passed to our function. Every browser will pass an event handler function, the event itself. It's an event object that describes a bunch of information about the event.
Wait, event object. Okay, what is that?
This is not going to work. And that's because in our onClick here, we really don't get to decide what parameter gets passed to our function. Every browser will pass an event handler function, the event itself. It's an event object that describes a bunch of information about the event. In fact, I can see that really quick here. I will, instead of console logging clicked, let's console log ID, which we're going to be disappointed in what actually happens. I'll hit save, click a box, and you'll see I get a synthetic base event, clearly not the ID of the box that was clicked. However, we can work around this by, instead of just blindly running props.toggle, we can run our own function, which then runs props.toggle. This is the function that is going to receive the event.
Come on. Amazing. You can do this? I didn't know that.
However, we're not going to make use of that, so I'll just delete event. And then this function can run props.toggle, and now we have the ability to pass whatever we want here. In this case, what we should pass is the ID of this box. However, currently, we're not receiving that ID. Sure, I have this key prop. However, the key prop really is intended for something completely different, and I'm fairly certain that if I even tried to access that key prop, let's console log props.key, yeah, I'm going to get a bunch of undefineds. I don't have access to props.key inside of this component, but that doesn't stop me from...
Does undefined mean that you don't have access? I don't know. Why do we get undefined a lot of times?
passing another prop, let's call it ID, and it essentially is the exact same thing. Now I do have access inside of box to props.id, so if I console log props.id,
Why do we have the access to ID but not to the key? What the?
I get the IDs of each of the boxes. And now I can use props.id to pass that information, pass the ID to my toggle function. Now over in app.js, if I console log the ID that's coming in, of course this will only run when I click it. Let me click the very first box, and that is my ID of 1. This one should be 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Awesome. This is great news because now I can use that ID to update the correct square in my setSquares function. At this point, I think this is something that you'll be able to do as a challenge. This lesson's getting a bit long, so that's what we'll do in the next lesson.
I think I can do this. So it should actually take in the previous squares, right? Previous squares, and it should spit out previous squares dot map dot map if id equals I don't know. So in here, I don't know what's happening. So inside of map, we can pass in a function, and this can take the element. So if element, if element is what? If element is equals id, then return not of not of what? Damn, this is difficult. So since previous state is actually an object with an ID and something. So this will actually take an object and we can destructure it, right? So this can be ID and all. And if so this can be IDE maybe. This if IDE is equals ID, then we return not of on, or we return not on, right? Else we return why do they show me curly braces, bro? Else just return ID. I think this should work. I'm not sure about this thing. Okay, let's see the error. Expected token. Hmm. Hmm. Okay, let's take an object, right? But I want to save the score. Maybe I can make a note, or maybe. Okay, let's consider this to be an object. So if object dot id is equals id, then we return id. Then we can return. Why is this not happening? Huh. Come on, bro. Please work. Ah, I don't know. Let's see. How do I go to the next?
I'll admit right now, this challenge is going to be a little bit tricky. Your goal is to use our setSquares function to update the correct square in the array. Remember, we're receiving the ID, and we just want to flip its on value from true to false or false to true. However, the trick is to not change state directly. As a hint, you could go back to the lesson on how we updated arrays in state if you need a reminder on how to do this. However, in that lesson, we mostly just touched on adding new items to that array. In this case, we're not adding new items, we are updating one of the existing items. At this point, it might be tempting to use an array method like splice. However, that is going to directly modify your state, because splice alters the array that it's run on. So don't let any of that scare you. I really want you to try your very best to do this. If after maybe 20 minutes you're still struggling on figuring this out, you can always just hit play and we will walk through this together. So let's have at it. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge.
I haven't spent 20 minutes, but it's okay.
Okay, we'll use our set squares function. As usual, we do need access to our old version of squares in order to determine the new value of our squares. So I'm going to say previous squares. And instead of being really clever and figuring out a way to do this on a single line, I'm just going to open up this function so we have some breathing room to create variables and do whatever we need. In fact, let me solve this in maybe the least clever way I can think of. I'm going to create a new array. We'll say new squares. I'll set that equal to an empty array, and I'll do a very simple C-style for loop. We'll say I0.
Now this is what I thought of, but this is like not good code. I think I thought
I is less than previous squares.length, I++. And my goal here is to look at each square in the array of squares, and if its ID is equal to the ID that our toggle function got, then we will simply flip the on value to the opposite of whatever it currently is. If we are looking at a square that is not the one with this ID, then we'll simply push that to our new squares array. So let's say our current square is the array of previous squares at the index of I. Maybe updated square is equal to an object equal to the ID given to our function. And I'll say maybe updated square is equal to an object that has all the properties of my current square, except the on property is going to be the opposite of my current square.on. And then I have this new object, and I will push that to my new squares array. So I'll say new squares.push updated square. However, if the ID is not the same, so I'll say else, we're just going to simply push the current square to our new squares array. At the end of this for loop, we should end up with an array that looks almost identical to the original array prev squares. However, one of the items should have a flipped value for its on property. And so we can see this is getting a little bit long, but there's my for loop. At the end, we'll simply return, because that's what we need to do from our set squares function, is return the new value of state. We'll return our new squares array. To be totally honest, I haven't tested this out. Let's hit refresh, see if this works. Oh, look at that. Awesome. Let's walk through exactly what this is doing. Let me clean up my challenge to buy us some room here. Every time I click on one of these squares, it's running the click event handler that we defined here. That click event handler is running the toggle function that it received through props and passing in the ID that it also received through props. That toggle function is taking that ID, running set squares, and running this function to determine what the new square should be. We look at the previous array of squares and simply generate a new array, loop over the previous array, and when we run into the square in our loop where the ID matches the ID passed into toggle, we create a new object that will replace the old object.
But this is like, what if we have like crores of data and then we'll just make a new array and store it in it, and then replace the previous state with the new state, and we'll actually re-render all the crores elements or millions of elements, and that I think there will be an efficient way. But even map does it, right? Map also changes the state of every element in that array.
And push that to our array. If the IDs do not match, we just push the current square in its current form without any changes made to our new array, and we return that. By returning this new array, React will update our squares state array, which means that it will then re-render this component, remap over all of our squares, and create 6 new box components, pass the on value, which was the same in 5 of the squares but different in one of them, and then in our box component, it will simply take that prop and determine what the background color should be. All of that seems really complex. I totally understand that, but you can see it's quick, and there really is no lag in doing this at all. At this point, we could just move on from this. Let's say it's a feature we're adding to some app we're creating. However, as we've learned, React really adheres to the principle of writing declarative code. What we have here is very imperative. Doing a C-style for loop this way works perfectly without any problem. So if you're happy with this, you can just move on. But I think it might be worth our time to take a look at how we might write this slightly differently using something a little more declarative instead of imperative. So that's what we'll do in the next lesson.
Will we decrease the time complexity or just change it from imperative to declarative?
I'm not going to bother making this a challenge this time. I think I'll just walk you through how I oftentimes will update an item in an array using a more declarative method instead of using a C-style for loop like we have here. So let me go ahead and just delete everything inside. And I think what I'll do is use the .map method to help me create a new array and return that array all in one go. So I can say return the previous squares.map, and whatever I put into my map function here is going to help determine my new version of the array, which then gets returned from my .map and returned from set squares. This is a lot of returns happening all in one, but let's just see how I would do this. I need to look at each square inside of my map, and whatever I
But we are modifying the previous squares if we are calling the map function on it. Or are we not? Maybe we are not.
return from this callback function inside of my .map is what will get placed at the same index in my original array in the new array that I return. So what if I were to use a ternary that's inside of my .map to do this? I need to look at each square inside of my map, and whatever I return from this callback function inside of my .map is what will get placed at the same index in my original array in the new array that I return. So what if I were to use a ternary that said, does square.id match the ID passed into my toggle function? If so, I want you to return a new object that has all of the properties of square except for the on property, which is the opposite of square.on. However, if the ID does not match, that's my else here, then I can simply return the square. The only thing I'm missing now is the return keyword. I tried to leave it out in the beginning because these two returns can be a little confusing at first. So fingers crossed, let's hit save, and look at that, everything is updating beautifully. Obviously, what we have here is a lot more concise in terms of lines of code, but it does require a bit more of an advanced understanding of JavaScript to fully comprehend. In my experience, what I have here is not so clever that other software engineers would not understand it, and therefore I personally would prefer a solution that looks more like this. I would definitely spend some additional time understanding this if this is confusing, but I will walk us through it one more time. Every time box gets clicked, it runs this function, not just props.toggle, but this function that we've defined inline here. That function will run props.toggle. Remember, we did that so we could pass a parameter, a custom parameter, to props.toggle, which we decided to be the ID of the box itself. Then if we go over to the toggle function, it will call set squares, our state setter function, and we need to use the callback function version of set squares because we do care what the previous array looked like. So we look at the previous squares and we're going to map over those squares. As a reminder, .map returns a new array without modifying the original array that will have the same length as the original array, and whatever we return from the callback function of .map is what will get placed in the same index in the new array as what was in the original array. What we're doing every time we loop over an item in this array is we're checking if its ID matches the ID. This ID here is the ID that we passed into our toggle function. If those IDs match, then that means it is the square that was clicked. If that's true, then I want to replace the old object with a brand new object, which is why I have these curly braces here. And this is crucial so that I'm not updating state directly. This object is going to pull in all of the values of square exactly as it was, but then it's going to overwrite the on value with its opposite. However, if this is not the box that was clicked, then just give me the old square. In this case, because I'm not making any modifications to it, I don't need to create a new object and spread in the old square or anything like that. I can just hand the old square object directly to my new array. Awesome work. I really hope you were able to follow along with that logic. This truly is something that just takes a lot of practice. At this point, one of the very best things you could do is just delete our toggle function completely and try to recreate it from scratch. In the end, this toggle function is the most complex part of what we have here, so that would be a great place to start if you really want to challenge yourself. I did want to show you one other rather clever solution that we could use instead of passing an ID down to the box, and that is that we could just say our toggle function that we're passing down, just like we did inside of our box, is going to be an individualized toggle function, this entire function here. However,
Now that's something cool.
we can pass the square.id immediately as we're passing this toggle function down. In essence, this creates something called a closure, where each instance of our box will have its own toggle and an entire function here. However, we can pass the square.id immediately as we're passing this toggle function down. In essence, this creates something called a closure, where each instance of our box will have its own toggle and it will remember its own ID, which means I can get rid of this ID prop, and over in box, I can change this back to just toggle, or rather, props.toggle. If I hit refresh, we can see that it's working exactly like it was before.
This is so confusing, to be honest. Like, okay, it has a square.id. How does it have it? Because of this.
We can pass the square.id immediately. It will remember passing this toggle function down. In essence, this creates something called a closure, where each instance of our box will have its own toggle and it will remember its own ID, which means I can get rid of this ID prop and...
How is it a closure? What exactly? Closure. Function inside a function. And somehow that inner function remembers something. I don't know.
And over in box, I can change this back to just toggle, or rather, props.toggle. If I hit refresh, we can see that it's working exactly like it was before. Again, awesome work. I really hope that as you have followed me in this mini-series on setting state and creating this rather silly little app, that you have worked on the challenges that I've given you. If you haven't, it's not too late. Don't just push forward. Go back and work on these challenges. Make sure that you really understand everything that we've done so far. Pushing forward without understanding this is not going to help you. It's only going to make it harder going forward. Spend the time now to really clarify these things, ask questions in the Scrimba Discord, and then when you really understand it, you can be happy knowing that you are ready to move forward.
I think I'll rewatch what I've done. I think I can stop.
Okay, well, this might look familiar. This is our joke component from the previous section, and we're going to use this to kick off a sort of mini-series on learning about conditional rendering in React. Using and understanding conditional rendering is very important in React because you will see it everywhere in React code. To start us off, I have a challenge for you. You're going to create some state called isShown,